Hi and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the world of ISO. I'll look at the reasons why using a low ISO will take you to the next level with your photography, and also give you a number of reasons as to why using a low ISO is beneficial to the final quality of your images. My name's Andy, welcome to the channel. Let's grab our gear and let's head on up to the location. There's no better time to explain what I'm talking about than to capture some images here during golden hour and during sunset. First, let's quickly refresh on where ISO fits into the exposure triangle. ISO is a critical component of the exposure along with the aperture and the shutter speed. ISO basically determines the sensitivity of your camera shutter, unless of course you have an invariant sensor, which is on some of the more high-end later cameras, and I'll mention that again in a little bit more detail further in the video. Essentially, the lower the ISO number, the more light you need, but we'll talk about how we can utilize this as we go through the video. Now, there's a lot of talk at the moment about using high ISOs. Now, what I've really noticed about this is there's a lot of that talk is when people are using pro spec, quite often cameras, and also with sensors with invariant ISO sensors that I'll talk about here. But I suspect that if you're the average photographer like myself that has what I would consider a normal amateur level spec camera, a beginner's camera, and maybe some of the older pro spec cameras, your sensor is not going to be ISO invariant. So what are the downsides of a high ISO? I mean, you've got things like image noise, you've got degradation of the shadows and highlights. What I'm going to do is give you real life examples caught here tonight on location and actually show you the difference that the ISO makes at 100 and also 3200, and also show some of the options of maybe denoising at the 3200 option, but also still showing you why that is not necessarily a better approach to using a low ISO. Okay, I'm going to go and set up now and capture some images to show you. Whilst I'm doing that, please hit that like and subscribe button and we'll capture those images. I'm all set up now. Sunset's about an hour away, so we've got a good bit of golden hour, so let's now dive into the benefits of using low ISOs. And the first big reason for this is primarily the quality of the image. Once you start taking the ISO to a higher sensitivity, whether that be 400, 800, 1600, 3200 or even beyond, you start to introduce significant amounts of noise into the actual image. By reducing the noise in your image, you're actually going to increase the amount of detail captured in your final image, which will enhance your post-production. So let's now capture a couple of images. One will be captured at ISO 100 and the other one will be captured at ISO 3200.
So this is the first image that I'm going to capture at ISO 100. It breaks a number of composition rules, but I really love the detail in the sky, the silhouette of the tree and the sunset in the distance and the layers of land at the bottom. I've captured that at ISO 100. Let's now switch our ISO. Let's up that to 3200, and what we'll have to do now is compensate, remembering our exposure triangle, bring our shutter speed down. So you can see that's made quite a significant difference now to the shutter speed. Again, we'll capture that image and we can use those for our comparisons.
So let's take a look at these images now. We can clearly see the difference at ISO 100, where we've got a nice detailed image, and at ISO 3200 we've got a significant amount of noise that's crept into the image. Now, one of the options you have is to denoise it. If you use Lightroom, for example, you can use the manual denoise, or you can even use the new AI denoise. This will actually reduce the amount of noise in your image, but what it won't do is bring back detail, and I'll go on to that next. And that really brings me nicely onto the next issue of high ISOs, which is the amount of detail that you lose. You can, to some extent, eliminate the high noise levels within a high ISO. However, what you can't do within the image is pull back the detail. Using a low ISO, the sensitivity for the high dynamic range is so much greater. So you'll find that you capture more details in both the shadows and in the highlights. Once lost, those cannot be regained.
And in this image, you can see here that I've got it at ISO 100 again. So what we're going to do is capture that. Got it F10. What we'll do, we've got 1/30th of a second. Again, not the perfect composition, but the purpose here is primarily to show you the difference in the detail. So let me get that ISO back up to that now. I'm going to have to bring that, whoops, wrong way with the shutter. I'm going to have to bring that shutter speed back into play. So we can capture that now at ISO 3200 for comparison purposes.
So again, let's take a little look at our two images that we captured earlier. We can see at ISO 100, we can see that we've still got all of the detail within the actual image itself. But actually at the 3200 where we've applied denoise, we've actually lost all of that image. And in this particular case, I've got two examples. One is using the manual denoise and the other one is using the Adobe AI denoise within Lightroom. These two issues, the noise and the amount of detail, the high dynamic range of the actual sensor, these two are the most critical because you cannot fully recover the sharpness, the image quality and the detail in the image. And the greater the detail you can capture, the finer the actual image will be. So if you're wanting to capture those details, whether it be landscapes, portraits, wildlife, you really need to start considering using the lowest ISO that you can. And what about some of our benefits that we can get from using a low ISO? One of the brilliant and creative aspects of this is actually the ability to capture long exposures. I really love good long exposures. So to get the exposure correct for a waterfall, whether that be half a second or maybe even longer, whether you want to flatten the sea to create a milky effect on the ocean. When bringing down the ISO down to lower levels, that gives you greater flexibility to get that shutter speed that you require, and putting an ND filter in front just to bring that shutter down so that you can get the shutter speed required is the perfect solution to that. And the reason you can do that is, remembering the exposure triangle, at a low ISO setting, you need a slightly slower shutter speed. So this is great for actually capturing those long exposures. And in some occasions, as I mentioned, you may just need to put an ND filter on the front to get those really long exposures. And another really weird, I think, benefit is that actually using low ISOs extends your battery life, which is particularly pertinent in the mirrorless age, which do tend to eat up batteries much more so than DSLRs. So the reason for this is that the post-processing within the camera of your image, the noise reduction settings, the processing within the camera requires more processing when there's a significantly greater amount of noise in the image. It's not the biggest benefit in the world, but it does make a difference, especially in the mirrorless age. And I've mentioned post-processing before in the video, but actually, if you've lost the detail, if you've created so much noise, your post-processing, whether it be against the RAW and the JPEG, will become even worse. Your post-processing is going to be significantly more difficult. You can't reintroduce detail, for example. So your post-processing, your workflow becomes so much simpler, whether that be Lightroom, whether you're using RAW or JPEGs. Low ISO is your friend at this point. Examples of this are that because you've got the dynamic range at a low ISO, you can extend the details in the shadows, you can bring those out. And also in the highlights, you can bring those back into play. You can drop the highlights down just so that you pull the details out of those again. You can compress the contrast. Absolutely invaluable in post-processing because you've not lost that data. If you've got a high ISO with grain, you're going to have lost that detail. You're not going to be able to recover it. One thing I do want to highlight though is that this is a general rule that I apply when doing landscape photography and even other types of photography. I try to use the lowest ISO possible, but you've got to really also always consider using the right ISO for the right situation. So for example, when I'm doing street photography or wildlife photography, because the images are changing, the light is changing on me all of the time, quite often I'll switch to auto ISO for those. So I'll either be in manual or aperture priority, and I'll actually use the ISO to adjust within the camera dependent upon whether I'm on manual or aperture priority. And I will let that go as high as I want it to go. I don't set the limit on that because I still want to capture that and actually remember that grain can, especially in street photography, which I am just starting to get into a lot more. Within street photography, grain can add real atmosphere and value to that image. And it can in landscape as well. If you're capturing a misty image, you may want to keep and retain grain within that image. So don't be scared to push the ISO. What I'm not saying is this is a rule. What I'm saying is these advantages apply to a low ISO. So when you're not looking to use a high ISO, try to be as low as possible on that setting. Feel free to drop a comment down below. I'd love to know your thoughts. What ISO settings do you use? Do you agree or disagree with what I'm saying here? And there you have it. These are my reasons why I believe you should always consider using the lowest possible ISO with your camera. If you find this useful, please remember to like and subscribe. Your support for the channel is massively appreciated. Remember to check out some of my other videos as well, where I've covered on-location tutorials and also post-processing tutorials. Until next time, your company has been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you again on future videos.